A great teacher who inspires you to take chances and look at the world in different ways, including 2 feet higher in the air, well, that kind of person is hard to come by. I was lucky enough to have several excellent teachers in all of my schooling days. In fact, my English teacher in college remained one of my closest friends until a few years ago when he retreated from the world and basically stopped talking to people. Or at least to me. Did he just ditch me? And if so, should I shoot myself with my dad's gun over it? Now, regular listeners must be wondering how I'm going to segue from all that darkness to promoting our sponsor. How is any of what I just said connected to an online coffee company? Well, it's not. I'm just going to clunk the gears and start talking about Sparkplug Coffee. They make their beans extraordinary, but those little brown guys in the bag are also the freshest, fairly traded, premium Arabica beans that can be rustled up in all of Canada. Don't worry if you usually use half calf or decaf. Sparkplug can provide either of those calves too, amongst their wide variety of blends and roasts, and shake things up sometimes by looking at their rotating seasonal blends. Dead Poet Society was filmed in Delaware of all places, but even though Sparkplug is a Canadian company, people who live in the Weir or in any part of the continental United States can get in on this. Americans are just like their northern neighbors in that they'll get their shipments sent in a week or less, and we Canadians don't even have to throw some money down for the delivery costs. Seize the moment, or the day, or something, and start a membership in the Autopilot Coffee Club. Deals and perks will be available to you in a way that they aren't for non-members, plus you'll save buckaroos on every single order. Feel free to customize that membership to get your orders when it suits you. Generic, stifling Coffee of the Month Club and all those kinds of rules? No, sir. Sparkplug.coffee is their website. Make it sparkplug.coffee/HYES, and you'll save 20% off your very next order. Our HYES promo code is your one-time only friend. All right then, this is a solo show, and I haven't done one of those in a long time. Let's see if I have the patience to talk to myself like I used to. And action. Have you ever seen Dead Poet Society? Hiya, movie monkeys, and yes, it's a Friday, and I am podcasting. I haven't posted a solo show on a Friday since I yapped about To Have and Have Not on May 31st. I took the summer off from doing the extra shows and just didn't announce I was going to do that. 1 or maybe 2 months turned into 3. But here we go with me talking on my own in the 608th edition of Have You Ever Seen? And I'm Ryan Ellis, the guy who was a pretty good student but didn't really take chances and risk getting kicked out of school the way these impudent punks do. Of course, my wife Bev isn't here for this particular extravaganza. In fact, the plan is for her to start doing fewer Monday shows, probably 1 fewer per month, so I'll be covering movies by myself a little more often in the future, not just on Fridays. Anyway, this plot breakdown by one man will be filled with spoilers, asides, and at least a little bit of tomfoolery. But before I start breaking down the poets who are no longer alive, I will tell you that I'm introducing a new wrinkle into this podcast, and some of you may be thrilled to hear that, others might yawn. But it's trivia. I know, we do trivia from time to time anyway, but this will be movie trivia not specific to the movie of the day. I've been listening to Doug Loves Movies ever since I started listening to podcasts back in 2011, and of course there's a lot of trivia on his show. Anyone could cheat and look up things while listening to DLM, but what would be the fun in that? Same goes here. As we've said in the podcast a few times, I've been hosting trivia nights for our friends ever since the pandemic started, and we just had our 69th game back in mid-August. Stop it with your 69 jokes, you old dads. Anyway, I went back and I looked at my old trivia games in 2020, and ever since, really, and copied a bunch of them into one big file, and I'll dole some of them out at the end of this episode. Maybe we'll do trivia when Bev is sitting in with me too, but I'll at least do it during solo shows. But back to our movie. So, Day Seizing was released by Touchstone Pictures in early June of 1989, which means it's a Disney movie. And it also means this one had its 35th birthday just a few months ago. The budget was not that big, but the box office haul was. It made over 235 million smackers worldwide. And of course, that's unadjusted money. It stayed in the top 10 weekend after weekend, but it was never number 1 on any given weekend, which isn't surprising when you're up against Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Batman, and Lethal Weapon 2, as this was that summer. The film was 10th at the domestic box office in '89, 1 spot ahead of When Harry Met Sally, which starred Robin Williams' good friend, Billy Crystal. I reviewed Batman a few months ago, and that was the biggest hit of 1989. Batsy was also number 1 worldwide, but I guess the allure of Robin Williams was enough to make Dead Poet Society 3rd at the worldwide box office that year, vaulting ahead of Lethal Weapon 2, Ghostbusters 2, and Back to the Future 2. It was behind all those domestically. Wikipedia says it was 5th worldwide, but Box Office Mojo says 3rd. Get your story straight, guys. We're at war. In any case, Disney must have been very happy that this talky, literate movie was so popular overseas with audiences who might not speak English. Dead Poets has pretty good numbers on Rotten Tomatoes, 84% of critics give it a good review, and 92% of audiences do too. There are 63 critical reviews, 53 of which are fresh, and their average is 7.2 out of 10. Although Siskel and Ebert were not big fans of it, neither was Pauline Kael, although she thought Robin was great, even if Ebert wasn't into what Robin brought to the production. He felt like the vamping and the impressions of famous people didn't fit the film, plus he resented that this got Oscar nominations that he felt should have gone to Do the Right Thing, especially Best Picture. This flick also ranks 191st on IMDb's 250. I wouldn't say that shocked me, but I just didn't expect it. Of course, this is a movie about boys, and I assume it's mostly boys and young men who vote for the IMDb 250, so I guess that does track. And the film won an Oscar. That was for Tom Schulman's original screenplay. Robin Williams was up for Best Actor, Peter Weir for Best Director, and the movie was nominated for Best Picture, but Daniel Day-Lewis for My Left Foot, Oliver Stone for Born on the 4th of July, and Driving Miss Daisy won in those three categories. Schulman wrote a perfectly fine script, and I've always been a fan of this film, but he was up against Crimes and Misdemeanors, Do the Right Thing, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and When Harry Met Sally that year. So Tom won over Woody Allen, Spike Lee, Steven Soderbergh, and Nora Ephron. And I think I like all their scripts even more than this one. Every one of those. So bad choice? No, but I think if you revoted today, Spike or Nora would win. Oh, and one more note about Schulman's script is that he didn't win the Writers Guild Award for screenplay written directly for the screen, even though generally that and the Oscars are connected. Woody Allen won the WGA for Crimes and Misdemeanors, one of his very best movies. I watched Schulman's Oscar acceptance speech, which was nice, but nothing special. He was presented with his award by a stunning Jane Fonda, who effusively paid tribute to how important the writers are to the filmmaking process. And I'll have to forgive Janie for pronouncing Steven Soderbergh's name wrong. She said Soderbergh, and calling his movie Sex, Lies, and Videotapes, plural. He was new on the scene. It was his first movie. Oh, and unless I've got the wrong black man, I think Schulman was seated a few people away from Spike Lee. Tom was in the middle of the row and had to scooch past Spike, so Mr. Lee was literally being passed by. Robin Williams' Carpe Diem speech was ranked 95th on the American Film Institute's Top 100 Quotes. Dead Poets Society was also 52nd on AFI's Top 100 Cheers, the most inspiring list. And this movie is very inspiring. Not surprisingly, it's the only movie with dead in the title that made the most inspiring list. Robin's character John Keating was also a nominee for the Top 50 Heroes, and the film was up for the 1998 and 2007 AFI Top 100 lists, so the main greatest movies of all time lists. As for the story, it's pretty well known, but I'll lay it out for you anyway. I haven't really done this in these solo shows very often, like Bev does when we do shows together, but I guess I'll give you a plot breakdown right now, then I'll go through the plot. A little redundant maybe, but might make some sense. Robin Williams plays John Keating, the new English teacher for the 1959 session at the fictional Wilton Academy in Vermont. He was once a student there, and he's back as a highly touted instructor who's taking over for the retired English teacher. Ethan Hawke is Todd Anderson, and Robert Sean Leonard is Neil Perry. They and 5 other young actors are some of Keating's favorite students, who are inspired by him to love poetry. Is he an English teacher or poetry specifically? Well, whatever. I guess it's the same basic idea. While he doesn't deliberately encourage them to do what he did when he went to Welton, they find out he was in what was called the Dead Poets Society long ago, and they copy that group by meeting late at night in a nearby cave to read poems. Neil is the most inspired of all the boys to carpe some diem, and he decides to defy his father by becoming an actor, which has tragic results. But at least we get an emotional ending when the boys, touched the most by their teacher's inspiration, defy the headmaster's oppressive expectations of conformity, and stand up, literally, for Mr. Keating. They literally stand up for him. I haven't done that so much in a while, have I? I love that thing from Parks and Rec. Literally? Rob Lowe. I said this is set in Vermont, but Peter Weir and his team filmed in the early winter in Delaware, of all places. No disrespect to a state special to Joe Biden, but I don't think a lot of motion pictures have been made in Delaware, have they? Now, we're talking about an Episcopalian all-male prep school. I didn't know what Episcopalian even meant, so I looked it up and found out it's a pretty devout form of Christianity. And yet it's not like religion is an overbearing part of this story, the way religion so often is overbearing. It's a subtext, I guess, but I don't think we're meant to think better or worse about the Episcopalian faith when the credits roll. A non-religious man who runs a prestigious school can be a totalitarian butt wipe just as much as a man of faith might be. I also found it to be an interesting choice to set this movie just a few months before the turn of the decade. The 50s were considered a stodgy time in American history. People like Nolan were the ones who ruled the world. But the 60s sure weren't. People like Keating would not really rule the world, but have more of a voice than they ever had before. And wouldn't some of these boys have loved being 17 or 18 instead, about 10 years later, 67, 68, 69? But they were actually born in the early 40s, if you do the math, which means they were way too young to fight in World War II or Korea. I guess some of them might have been drafted to go to Vietnam. Well, they're mostly rich kids, aren't they? So maybe not. Deferments and such, money buys you out of Vietnam, or did buy you out of Vietnam. Also, as for those guys being born in the early 40s, That's when Keating was a student at Welton. Norman Lloyd plays the humorless headmaster, Mr. Nolan. Apparently Gail Nolan, that's what it says on Wikipedia, and that's the first name of one of the actors, Gail Hansen, who plays Charlie Dalton. Anyway, Mr. Nolan, he announces that 75% of Welton grads go to the Ivy Leagues. I guess that's good. I don't know much about the Ivy Leagues. I do believe that 75% is 3 out of 4. And if I'm wrong, then I clearly don't belong anywhere near the Ivy Leagues. I don't anyway. As the parents meet the men in charge, we learn that Todd's brother Jeffrey went to Welton years ago, and he was one of their finest. So Todd is a legacy hire, I guess. And I assume the Andersons have some dollars. Neil will say later that his family doesn't have money like Charlie Dalton's family does, but don't all these boys have to come from pretty well-off families if they're going to the finest institution in the country? I guess Neil and maybe some of the other ones could have gotten a scholarship, but they can't be too poor. It's also established at the beginning here that there are plenty of younger boys who go to Welton, and some of them are crying as their parents say goodbye. You know, Todd's probably on the brink of crying, but he isn't actually doing it. Not that he seems like he's that close to his parents anyway. They don't get him. We'll get to that soon. Don't understand him, I mean. I don't think we ever, or almost ever, see any of the young kids again after this opening. Oh, maybe in the assemblies. Otherwise, they're never around. I guess they wouldn't be, but it's just funny to make it very clear this is a school for all kinds of boys of all ages, but we don't really ever deal with them after the opening. Maybe a little bit in the assemblies. Okay. And one of my favorite ironies, Charlie and Cameron are roommates, which is ironic considering how much they end up hating each other. They have very little in common even before Charlie socks Cam in the face. And I say Cam, but keep in mind that he's actually Richard Cameron. So he should be going by Rick or Rich or Ricky or something. Charlie gets called by both his first name and his last name plenty, and of course he prefers to be called Nawanda about midway through the film. Meeks and Pitts are always called that, not by their first names. But Neil, Todd, and Knox are always Neil, Todd, and Knox, at least with their friends. Of course, Nolan and the older generation tend to call them by their last names. Mr. Anderson, Mr. Perry, Mr. Cameron. Setting the stage for the tragedy to come later in the movie, Mr. Perry tells Neil that the boy has too much stuff on his plate, so he orders him to drop some extracurricular activities. No more school annual, for one thing. And if you're Canadian, I think it's a Canadian thing specifically, we call it yearbook. But anyway, same idea, I guess. He was going to be the assistant editor, but too bad, kid. Some other schmo will have to immortalize people's memories. Kurtwood Smith was so awesome as Clarence Boddicker in RoboCop just 2 years before this, and it's more of a gray area in this case, but he is an effective villain in this too. He and Nolan and Cameron are as close to bad guys as there are in Dead Poets Society. Some people might say, why am I air quoting that, as I just did, by the way? But it's more of a gray area, let's face it. They're not killing anybody. Nolan's oppressive, but that's the way things were and probably still are done in schools like this. But yeah, somewhere in the Bad Movie Dad Hall of Fame, you will find a snapshot of Mr. Tom Perry. He wouldn't be as highly ranked as Jack Torrance or Darth Vader, but he'd be somewhere in the back. Maybe somewhere in the back. Now, unlike another 80s movie about school, Revenge of the Nerds comes to mind, and I reviewed that earlier this year, we do see the boys in class. They're in Latin, they're in this and that, and we see a lot of their experiences in Keating's English class. Other than being introduced in the first few minutes of the film, Robin Williams' first scene is when he tells the guys to call him, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," on I guess the first day of school, which eventually brings us to the quite famous Carpe Diem, seize the day, make your lives extraordinary scene. Robin makes quite a few jokes during all this because he's Robin Williams, and the boys don't seem to know whether they should laugh or not. They can't possibly be used to someone behaving like this at this school. One of the last things Keating says here is that we are food for worms, lads. I like that, and he's right. We're all going to die no matter how much we accomplish. Might as well do something awesome while we're here, like make a podcast, or listen to a podcast. You and I, we're heroes. We are so not heroes. The guys seem to get together in study groups every night, although Knox misses out one night because he has to go to dinner with friends of his parents, the Danburys, and their son Chet is dating the lovely Chris Knoll, who opens the door when Knox arrives, and our boy Noxious is thunderstruck. He's been thunderstruck. It's love at first sight. It's hard to blame him. The 21-year-old Alexandra Powers, who plays Chris, is lovely. Back to Keating's class. He doesn't like how the intro in their poetry book was written by a scholar named J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D., who ranks poetry on a graph. It's excrement. When I first saw this movie, I didn't know what that even meant. Of course, as you probably know, it's poop. Anyway, excrement because to John, there are no rules about how to rate a poem. He's got a point. Tom Schulman gives Robin some excellent lines here where he says, "No matter what anyone tells you, words and ideas can change the world. And we read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And while business and medical type jobs are noble pursuits, and we need them to sustain life, poetry, love, and beauty are what we stay alive for." That's a line I remember from this movie as much as any other because, yeah, look at my job. I don't really have much passion for it. But I do for this, and I do for, of course, my wife and our friends and our families and other things I do, my softball teams. Some people obviously live to work, but I work to live. Something tells me that John here didn't vote for a fellow like Dick Nixon the following year. Mr. Teacher here gets a great parting shot to put a button on this scene when he says, "The powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse." Robin looks right at Hawke when he says, "What will your verse be?" I say that Schulman wrote a lot of great lines for Williams, and he did, but of course Williams is often quoting other writers, poets, and so on. So it's certainly not all original. Neil digs up an old annual that tells us that Keating, or Keats, was the man most likely to do anything, and they discover that he was once a member of the, wait for it, are you waiting? Dead Poets Society. The fellas ask him about it while he's out for a stroll, but it's important to note that he does discourage them from starting their own society because he knows the administration wouldn't like it. Of course, he talks about how wonderful it was to get to do that back in the day, so he really should know these guys are going to start their own chapter of the society. And since we see in Keating's old poetry book that it was indeed 1942 and old John was a student at Welton, he's not that much older than they are. He is a father figure to them, but he can barely even actually be their father. I got to wondering, why would going out to a cave and reading poems get the seven of them in trouble? Is it because they're leaving the campus grounds in the middle of the night? They leave at midnight and they come back at 2 o'clock the very first time they go to the cave. Okay, but it's not like they do anything illegal. Sure, they end up smoking during the meetings, and I guess they could have been doing drugs or drinking, but they could just as easily do that in their rooms. I guess the point is just that Nolan wants conformity and obedience, not letting these guys be all creative and buck the rules just because they want to. And I also got to thinking about how this group is 7 guys. That means that one of them has a roommate who's not cool enough to be part of their group. They let Todd in, and he's practically mute. I guess maybe it's Knox's roommate? Poor left-out fool. But yeah, they read a few pieces while they're in the cave, leading Charlie to read a poem he's jotted down in the back of a nude centerfold. This movie is not R-rated, I don't think, and yet you do see full frontal, at least upper half frontal. Anyway, typical Charlie, do something crass while also seizing the moment, or the day, as the fella says. Not that I'm complaining about seeing the centerfold's nudie bits, not at all. Back in class, and Keating tells his charges that poetry's purpose is to woo women. No wonder I barely had any dates in high school. I wasn't rattling off poems. I was, and still am, more of a prose guy. Robin got to riff a lot in this movie, and here's an example of it. They get into some Shakespeare, which makes most of them groan before they start doing it, which he reads in funny voices, and that has them in stitches. Even Mr. Anderson is grinning ear to ear and laughing constantly, although Ethan Hawke said sometime after this movie came out that he didn't love the way Robin improvised and acted so goofy. I guess the young actor was trying to stay in character, and being made to laugh was messing him up. He came to appreciate how good Williams was in this, though, and I think they went on to be friendly later in life. Setting us up for the very last scene is right here, when Keats jumps up on his desk to remind himself to look at things in a different way. Then all the boys are invited to walk up to his desk and take a look for themselves, while he inspires them not to lead lives of quiet desperation and dare to strike out and find new ground. They're even going to have to write and read aloud a poem of their own in a few days, which, as Keating knows, and we certainly know, scares the bejesus out of the introverted Todd. I always like when movie characters have to act within a movie, as in a character is pretending to be something else around the other characters. But here we have Neil wanting to flat out be an actor. He sees in a flyer that a local troupe is going to do A Midsummer Night's Dream. He's really pumped about auditioning and wanting to try to be an actor, even though Todd throws poop on the idea because he knows, or excrement on the idea, because he knows what Mr. Perry will say. And here's a fun comparison. Neil will get cast as Puck, of course better known his real name Robin Goodfellow in the play, which is an apt description of Robin Williams, isn't it? Robin Goodfellow. For he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good Robin. I guess just to open up the movie and insert a little action, Johnny K has the boys out on the pitch, hoofing a soccer ball after reading an inspirational line from a slip of paper while also listening to classical music. But we're back in the confines of the classroom, and now we see them read the poems they wrote. Naturally, Knox wrote about his infatuation with Chris. I always loved the guy Hopkins, the dopey-looking dude, talking about how the cat sat on the mat, which might have been brilliant if he had added something like, and he was fat, or just fatly. I remember getting a big laugh in my writer's craft class back in my high school days when I read a poem I wrote that went, "My tricycle has 4 wheels. Call me an anarchist." I think the look on my face when I just looked up self-satisfied was part of the reason why I made them laugh. So Knox and Hopkins poemed it up, but we're about to get my favorite scene in this entire movie, which I like even more than the ending. And that's when the barbaric yawper, Keating, makes Todd come up with a poem on the spot in front of the class after barbarically yawping. And this is the introvert's nightmare. Todd had said he didn't do the assignment, but does he ever come up with some creative ideas when he's forced to? And the whole poem about a sweaty-toothed madman is pretty good, especially the part about how the metaphorical blanket he mentions will never cover any of us, always leave us cold. And if Todsky doesn't get an A for this, then there is no justice. I'm sure a modern audience member might find fault with this scene. They might accuse Keating of bullying Todd. They might even get worked up because the teacher puts his hands on the kid. But look at the result. I was so lucky to have great teachers like this throughout my schooling, especially in high school and college. And I just want to pay tribute to the likes of Andrew Yap, Cindy Crosby, Al Ladner, Richard Giles, and many others who touched my life the way John Keating touches the dead poets' lives. And I'm not the only one to love those great people who taught me for how much they cared about and treated all of us. I bet 15 or 20 students just in my graduating class alone would say the exact same thing. There was soccer in Mrs. Doubtfire, and there's soccer in this movie. Well, there was a minute ago, but now they're actually playing soccer. Only this time Robin only cheers the boys on. He doesn't play with them the way he does with his son in Doubtfire. The guys carry him off the field on their shoulders while Beethoven's Ninth plays. So, more touching. This is the poster shot, and I believe it's what's on my DVD cover. This part where Robin is being body surfed by his enthusiastic students. We're back in the poetry cave, and they're trying to appear more grown up by smoking pipes. This session must be happening on the weekend because the sun is clearly streaming into that cave. Maybe it's Charlie's quite excellent playing of the saxophone, that drives Noxious over the edge to go call Chris. He needs to ask her out on a date, or he's going to kill himself. That might be dramatic foreshadowing too. Somebody else needs to act, or he'll kill himself. And Knox's need pays off because he gets invited over to a party at Chet's house that weekend, when Chet's folks will be out of town. Here's the silly walk scene, highlighted by Charlie exercising his right not to walk, which is his own version of taking the road less traveled by not traveling at all. The aim here is to learn about conformity and how, for instance, they can't judge the three guys who march in unison in front of them, because the rest of them joined in when one of them started clapping. Meantime, Todd gets a desk organizer from his parents as a birthday present, the same one he got from them last year, which Neil gets him to throw off the roof. It's a nice moment between them, because even though they would say they're friends, Neil is often pushing Todd in ways that Todd doesn't always want him to push. In this case, he welcomes it. The third time we see the seven guys in the poetry cave, Charlie crosses a line by bringing a couple of girls in, one of whom is played by Melora Walters, the actress in so many early PTA movies like Boogie Nights and Magnolia. The other girl played Lois in Goodfellas, the nanny who smuggles drugs for Henry. Charlie uses one of the girl's lipsticks to draw war paint in his face and tells the dudes he wants them to start calling him Nawanda. I always thought it was Nerwanda, but online it says Nwanda, N-U-W-Onda. I tried to find out what the significance of Nawanda is, but failed to get a clear answer and gave up because it's not that important. He just wants them to call him a name he made up for himself. Fair enough. All of this is cross-cut with the party at the Danburys, where a very drunk Knox strokes Chris's hair and kisses her forehead while she's passed out on the couch. Okay, carpe diem and all that, man, but her boyfriend is right there. Knox is lucky he doesn't get a worse whipping than what Chet gives him. Chris puts a stop to it, which is partly why Knox is able to walk out of there at all. And of course, doing this to a girl who's asleep, to use a very overused phrase, ages badly. He didn't get her consent, plus she'll make very clear to him in future scenes that she already has a boyfriend. She tells him over and over. Now, does it help at all that Knox is always talking about being in love with Chris? He doesn't want to use her for her body. He wants her for all of her. All of her. Why not take all of her? He just can't take no for an answer. This same year in 1989, Lloyd wouldn't take no for an answer from Diane and say anything, and I think our modern lens frowns on that storyline too. I feel like I've read that somewhere. Say anything, ages badly. I'm sure it does, but it's also one of the great romantic movies I've ever seen. Anyway, this movie was due for some drama, and we get it when Charlie writes an article in the school paper saying that girls should be allowed to attend Welton. He also mentions the Dead Poet Society in that article, and he makes it worse during a school assembly that was called because of this very article, when he pretends God is on the phone and wants to talk to Nolan about making the girl thing happen. And holy crapola, does Nolan ever make him suffer for his wiseassery. Charlie gets paddled hard on the buttocks and has to count aloud each time the headman lands a whack on him. Young Mr. Dalton's smirk is now gone. And what Nolan really wants is to know about what the Dead Poet Society is. He wants names. So now we have a McCarthy-esque Red Scare subtext going on too, and I guess it's the right time frame in 1959. But Charlie would fit in with the Hollywood 10 because he doesn't say anything about Neil, Pitts, Meeks, Cameron, Knox, or Todd. And he puts all their minds at ease when he comes back and says through his tears, or almost tears at least, he was crying I think earlier if nothing else, that Neil should be calling him Nwanda. So he's still in. Didn't rat them out. Even though Charlie never said anything about Keating being in the original Dead Poet Society, Nolan confronts John about the unorthodox teaching methods going on in the very same classroom. He saw that whole conformity thing when they were out in the courtyard. And this classroom is where Nolan got his own start teaching. It feels like he's there for more than just that, though. Clearly wondering just how influential Keating is on these young men. But the fact that he once taught that very subject in that room sets up nicely that Nolan is the logical man to take over for Keating at the end of the movie and be front row center when the boys stand up for their fired mentor. But we'll get to that later. Keating goes to see the guys after class and he's nice about it, but reprimands Charlie for his stupid stunt. It was a good line, though. If you said God was calling collect, now that would have been daring, is that what he says? Because getting kicked out of school would, if nothing else, mean he doesn't get to be in Keating's class anymore. Neil starts rehearsals for the play, but his father's found out about it and he's awfully chuffed about how Neil lied to Nolan about Mr. Perry giving permission. And even though opening night is only 24 hours away, Daddy-O demands that Neil bail on the play right here, right now. Right here, right now. Geez, man, you could have let him at least perform one time when it's only a day away, then make him quit. What about the other people? I guess he doesn't care about them. Of course, the elder Perry can't be the movie's bad guy if he cuts the kid the slightest break. Plus, he clearly doesn't think he can show weakness or compromise to his own son. Or compassion. He's not Tim Walls, for crying out loud. But the boy goes to talk to Keating about all this. We find out in this scene that Johnny Boy has a lady love over in London, but his place is here in America simply because he loves teaching, and we know that Welton is the best school in the country. Or so they say. Maybe they're just pulling a Trump here and saying they're the greatest, even if that's not actually true. I guess on the bright side, once Keating gets fired at the end of the movie, he has plenty of motivation to go to the UK to see about a girl. Anyway, John tries to convince Neil to try to get his father to see how important acting is to him. He decidedly doesn't tell the boy to disobey his father and just keep on being Puck, which is what Neil ends up doing. It's important that in a future scene, Neil lies to Keating about his father actually giving in and letting him keep acting. Robin plays that scene as if he doesn't trust that Neil really did talk to his father, despite what the kid is insisting is true. This is what Nolan and Mr. Perry will think is the smoking gun to turf Keating, that he told the kid to disobey his strict dad and do whatever the hell he wants. Knox, meanwhile, makes his puppy love situation worse by going to see Chris at her own school, offering up some flowers as he apologizes for kissing her at the party. She keeps saying no, but he storms into her classroom when she tries to go in there to get away from him and reads a poem instead. So she isn't giving him any green lights to do this, although she does show up at Welton the night of Neil's play to talk to Knox, yet again insisting he stop trying to win her heart. If nothing else, she's trying to save him from Chet. I noticed that Knox is the only one who seems interested in girls at all. Yeah, it's a boys' prep school, so not even really around girls. But Knox did find Chris. Maybe the other 6 guys are gay? Well, not Charlie. He found 2 women. Chris relents and agrees to go to Neil's play with Knox. The other 5 friends are already in the audience with Keating and they're glued to the performance. The troupe gets a standing ovation when it's over, and Neil's curtain call gets a barbaric yawp from the gang, but Neil's dad isn't in Chicago on business. The stern-faced dude actually shows up halfway through the play, and even though he can see that his son is good at this acting business, tough Titania. This isn't one of those, man, I get it now. My kid is talented. Nope, it's, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to corner you in a warehouse and blow your hand off with a shotgun, thus turning you into a cyborg. By the way, I don't think I ever really recognized that all the boys are saying, yup, yelling it out when Neil gets pushed ahead by the other actors to get his own little standing ovation. Nice callback to the scene where Todd created the poem in class. Robin was, of course, nominated for Best Actor for this performance, and he's very good in what was actually more of a supporting role, but I bet a big reason they recognized him was for the handful of times he plays it extremely serious. Here's another good example of that, because Keating can tell by the way Mr. Perry reacts that Neil is in for some very bad times. The teacher might even suspect that Neil will either be pulled out of Welton to go to military school, which is what Mr. Perry's plan is, he tells that to his son that night, or God knows. And for all John knows, Mr. Perry is a violent man. Perry can't say he's 100% opposed to violence either because he has a handgun in his home office, which Neil uses to blow his own head off that night. So yeah, the night of Neil's greatest triumph, that his best friends all share with him, turns into the last time they or anyone else ever see him alive. If he can't be an actor, he wishes to be nothing. The actress who plays Mrs. Perry stood out to me when I saw this again a few days ago. Carla Belver was only in one other big screen movie, but she plays the role of a cowed woman fairly well here. She barely speaks, and while she cries that night about how all this went down, she doesn't exactly push back on her husband for what he's putting their son through. She doesn't push back at all. It's a similar role to what the actor who plays Mark Wahlberg's father in Boogie Nights has to do. Eddie Adams' dad and Neil Perry's mama do not get a say in how their sons are being raised. I have mixed feelings about Schulman and Weir killing off Neil. It is incredibly melodramatic to do this for these reasons, even for a teenager. Although if you're a teenager in crisis and suicide seems like a good choice for you, get some help. But remember that episode of Friends with the woman who steals Monica's identity and talks about how she thought Dead Poet Society was so boring? She also felt like it was a crock that Neil would kill himself. As she says, wait a year, leave home, and do some community theater. I always love that part where you think she's going to say, that movie was so inspiring to me. No, it was so boring. Although I take issue with the next line that actress has when she says, "That's 2 hours of my life I'm never getting back." This notion that seeing a movie that disappoints you is a time travesty is stupid. You didn't know you weren't going to like the movie, nor did you know your favorite team was going to lose by 8 runs in the big game. You didn't know that that guy you were dating would end up ghosting you. Live life. Take chances. Maybe things will disappoint you sometimes. Just try to suck out some marrow, and if things end up being marrowless, well, having to sit through bad movies beats working, or being in jail, or being dead or something. So enough of this 2 hours of my life I'll never get back crap. Taking a stand. No more of this. I'll never get that time back. Were you working? But still, fake Monica isn't wrong that Neil could have just run away from home. You're not that far from New York, dude. Just gather up what you can, go to the bus station, and see if you can make it on Broadway. And if you don't make it because they say you're not good enough, then kill yourself. But I shouldn't crack so much wise about suicide. I know I just tried to be sympathetic a minute ago, but I like to crack jokes. We like Neil. Well, I did. And this is obviously a sad and tragic scene, especially when his mother gets hysterical when she sees what Neil has done to himself. Soon after, Todd has a breakdown while walking out in the snow. The other guys try to comfort him. Well, not Cameron. He's notably absent. And the filmmakers did the "I'm upset, so I'll vomit" thing, even back in 1989, huh? Have you ever puked because you were sad or shocked? Please tell me if you have, and maybe I'll stop ripping on filmmakers for using this tired device of, "I'm bothered, so the contents of my stomach are about to be seen." Because I think it's a crutch and it's unrealistic. Well, Todd isn't the only one at Welton who openly cries about the young Perry's fate, and I bet the scene that clinched Robin's second Oscar nomination was here, when he looks in Neil's desk and finds the 5 Centuries of Verse poetry book that he himself used to own, and he cries about the whole situation. I'm sure he feels at least partly responsible, even if he isn't actually responsible. The guys, minus Cameron and of course Neil, gather in an attic after Nolan announces there will be an investigation about Neil's suicide. Charlie rightly guesses that Cameron finked to Nolan and blamed it all on Keating. Cameron shows up, casually tossing off an, "I say let Keating fry. Why ruin our lives?" And that gets him a punch in the face from Charlie. So now Nwanda will be expelled, and since Cameron isn't likely to keep hanging out with these guys anymore, the group is going to be down to 4. Since Neil died on a wintry night, what's it been, maybe 4 months since the school year started and they formed the Dead Poets? Things went bad quickly. And since the 4 boys left in the society stand up against Nolan's totalitarianism at the end, I wonder if they'll find a way to keep meeting and reading poetry. That would be really risky, but if they're not kicked out, maybe. All the guys do get forced to sign a paper that dumps the Neil mess in Keating's lap. Well, Cameron isn't forced. He was eager to sell it the man who taught poetry. The investigation concludes that Keating inspired Neil to go against his father's wishes and continue acting. So they have their scapegoat, and Mr. Perry can spend the rest of his life thinking everything he did was fine. It was that hippy-dippy teacher who got his kid killed, and all this happened 6 or 8 years before people were even called hippies. Or dippies. Which finally leads me to my movie in a nutshell. So Dead Poet Society in a nutshell. Teacher doesn't even last 1 year at his new job. Was it even half a year? And to quote Robin from his other Best Actor performance in the 80s, "This will not look good on a resume!" If you're a fan of that other movie, you should recognize the line. So Keating gets turfed, and Nolan does take over the poetry class until they can find a permanent teacher. Even though this final scene is famous, and I do like it, I even love it, I find it really forced that Keating shows up to get the personal items out of his office in the back of the classroom while the kids are in the middle of a lecture. It could have waited, man. But if the remaining characters weren't there, we wouldn't get Todd standing up on his desk and calling out, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." It's fitting that the lovelorn Knox would be the second one to do this, rather than Pitsy or Meeks. Although you have to know that Charlie or Neil would have been number 2 if they were still there. About half the guys get up on their desk, although the way Weir films it, it seems like nearly all of them do. Even the nerdy kid with the runny nose and the cat sat on the mat guy stand up. But a wide shot at the end does show that only about half the fellas risked expulsion, which Nolan threatens Todd with when the kid first gets up on his desk. "Thank you, boys. Thank you, indeed." That line and that final shot of Robin's face became a popular meme after the comedian took his own life 10 years ago. And the clip I always see on YouTube when I watch this scene has some text that says something like, "No, thank you, Robin." I like how the very last shot is of Todd's face, framed between one of the other boys' legs. Makes you wonder if there's supposed to be some gay subtext there. Well, it made me wonder. This is a tear-inducing kind of scene, of course, but I didn't cry when I saw this last week. Other times, yes, just not last week. And I wonder what happens next, after Keating leaves and presumably all the boys get down off their desks. Nolan had said that the next person who says anything will be out of the school. Well, both Todd and Knox spoke up with an "Oh, Captain, my Captain," and a lot more of them got shoe dirt on their desks. So are they all kicked out? Not the squeaky nerd or the cat sat mat guy. So the cast. We've talked about Robin Williams' work plenty of times on this channel, but most of those reviews have come in just the past few years. We've discussed The Fisher King, Mrs. Doubtfire, which I did on my own 368 days ago, plus his Oscar-winning work in Good Will Hunting, and he has a brief voiceover role in AI. The man made a lot of comedies, and many of them were craptastic, but he also made some searing dramas, especially in that run in the early 2000s when he was in Insomnia and 1 Hour Photo. In fact, those are in the same year, in 2002. His brand of comedy was often too much, especially in things like Patch Adams, but he's made enough good or even great stuff that I still look back at the man very fondly. He's not one of Bev's faves, though, which is a big reason I chose to make this a one-man show. Believe this or not, but he's been gone since 2014. He was only 63 when he committed suicide on August 11th in 2014. And as I talked about when I covered Mrs. Doubtfire last year, my cousin Jason was his biggest fan. And if Williams was one of the funniest people in pop culture, well, Jason was one of the funniest people I ever knew in my own life. I don't think it was connected or anything, but Jay committed suicide himself several years ago. So when I see a Robin flick, I'm always thinking at least a little bit about my cousin. Ethan Hawke had also only been featured on this channel a few times before this year, but we discussed Reality Bites just a few months ago, and we'll be covering Boyhood on Monday. Before this year, we reviewed 3 Ethans, and they all started with the word before: Sunrise, Midnight, and The Devil Knows You're Dead. Hawke had just turned 18 when they shot this movie, so he was perfectly cast age-wise, and he does the quiet, shy introvert thing really well. Contrast him saying about 50 words in this movie to the thousands of words he says in all of Linklater's before movies. You know? Ethan has been in films for nearly 40 years now, but he's come into his own in a big way since the turn of the century, often in very serious dramas and horror movies. Is he one of our great actors? Well, no, he's not on the short list, but I like the guy, and I like his work in this movie. And the arc here is his, not Neil's or Keating's. Robert Sean Leonard hasn't been in that many movies and TV shows since he appeared in this, but he was in Marty's The Age of Innocence in 1993 and spent nearly 10 years working as a doctor on the TV show House. He also teamed up with Ethan Hawke again in Tape in 2001, so the movie Tape, T-A-P-E. I saw that again on YouTube just a few days ago. The movie is just the two of them and Uma Thurman, no one else. It's compelling in his obvious stage origins, but it's a good exercise for the two actors, and then for about 30 or maybe 40 minutes worth of Uma. And Rick Linklater directed it, as he often has when Hawke has been involved, including in Boyhood, which we're going to talk about on Monday. I thought Josh Charles looked a lot like Ethan Hawke in some shots in this movie, actually, and he's also the right age for one of these characters because he's even a little bit younger than old E.H. Charles got his start in Hairspray the year before he was in this, and that's the John Waters original, not Adam Shankman's musical that I love so much. Charles also did a fine job playing Sarah Silverman's husband in the searing drama I Smile Back about a decade ago. You want to see Sarah really stretch and do something different from her brilliant comedy? Look up I Smile Back. Gail Hansen did a good job as Charlie in this, but he didn't act all that much beyond it. His notable credit other than this is a tiny role in Woody Allen's Zelig, another one of my favorite Woody Allens. What he's been up to for the past 18 years is being a successful studio executive. Dylan Cussman plays Cameron, Mr. Cameron. Birds are agreeing with me or disagreeing with me or something. He was in the Tom Cruise version of The Mummy just a few years ago and was also one of the writers on that project. He was in Jack Reacher with Cruise too. So unless it's just coincidence, Tommy C. must like working with Dylan K. All right, this is going to be tough. Allelon Ruggiero, A-L-L-E-L-O-N, Ruggiero, maybe it's Ayon. He plays Meeks, who hasn't acted all that steadily since this came out the way that Cussman has. He's uncredited in 12 Monkeys. I can never say that very well. Uncredited. But doesn't have that much else in the resume that stands out all that much. I always felt like Peter Weir failed to get a close-up of him during the very last scene the way he does the other boys, because the shot of Meeks they do use looks a little shaky and almost like they might have reframed and zoomed in on what was a wide shot. Why'd you do Meeks dirty like that, Pete? Well, Ruggiero aside, the Australian director does clearly show a "we respect you and we thank you, John Keating" face on James Waterston at the end. The man with the unfortunate name of Pitts didn't act all that much throughout the 90s, although since the turn of the century he's been in a lot of miniseries and in one-off appearances in TV shows. Norman Lloyd was in his mid-70s when he played Mr. Nolan in this, but he lived for more than another 30 years. He directed and he produced throughout his career, but his acting credits are pretty fascinating all on their own. He worked with Hitchcock in the 40s and Chaplin in the 50s, and he also showed up, as Robert Sean Leonard did, in The Age of Innocence. Kurtwood Smith was coming off his phenomenal work in RoboCop, although he was many years away from calling Topher Grace a dumbass in that 70s show. Now that I think about it, I want to do what I often do and show some sympathy for the devil. Please allow me to introduce myself. And say he's not a villain in Dead Poets in the traditional sense. I guess I said that earlier, but I'm going to expound on it now. Expound. It's hard to truly hate Cameron either, because it's not like it's his idea to rat out Neil to Mr. Perry. He just saves his own skin when the school administration was clearly going to railroad Keating anyway. He is a rat, and maybe you hated him, but he's also a 17-year-old kid. I think if Keating had a chance to talk to the boys about them signing that letter, he'd tell them to do it. As for Mr. Perry, He's a hard-ass dad, yes, yet he is trying to do what he thinks is best for his son. How could he know that gunplay would be the answer? I bet given another chance, the old man would have rethought how he handled all that. He obviously cares about his son's future and he's devastated by what happens. Then again, he does go looking for someone to blame, and it seems like it's him who went after Keating, just assuming that the teacher got Neil all worked up about acting and caused the suicide. The last cast member I'll highlight is Laura Flynn Boyle, who plays Chet's sister, Ginny Danbury, and she is mentioned by Chris at one point, only she isn't in the movie because Weir cut her part out entirely. I don't think she was all that well known in 1989, so it wasn't a shocking insult to slice her out of the flick. If her part was ruining the pacing, then yeah, bye-bye. Chet doesn't need a sister. I had to check this out to confirm because I haven't seen Threesome in a very long time, but she is the woman in that three-pack with Stephen Baldwin and Josh Charles. The director was Peter Weir. Several years ago, we reviewed one of my favorite films of the 90s, and I think Weir's crowning achievement, The Truman Show. Weir has been up for 6 Oscars. 4 of those were for Best Director. The other nominations were for Witness, The Truman Show, and Master and Commander. So he's never won a competitive Oscar, but they gave him an honorary award in 2023. Maybe they made sure to do that then because he hasn't made a movie in well over a decade, or he hadn't then, he still hasn't now. They might as well reward him while they still can. He just turned 80, and while Scorsese and Spielberg are around that age too, and are still very active making movies, maybe when Weir hit retirement age back in the early 2010s, he thought, I've made a dozen or so pictures and I've been working since the late 60s. Enough is enough. It'd be debatable to call Weir one of the greatest directors ever, but anyone with Picnic at Hanging Rock, Gallipoli, and Green Card on his resume, in addition to the 3 or 4 others I already mentioned, is certainly somebody who has the respect of his peers. I believe that Williams even said when he was on Inside the Actors Studio that he took the part in this movie just to work with Weir, who's one of those directors, by the way, who rarely recasts his stars in other movies. Harrison Ford was in both Witness and The Mosquito Coast in back-to-back years, no less, and Mel Gibson did Gallipoli and The Year of Living Dangerously in back-to-back years, too. But then you get one-offs for Robin Williams, Gerard Depardieu, Jeff Bridges, Jim Carrey, and Russell Crowe. I'm not saying there's a conflict with Weir and those movie stars, but I always just find it worth mentioning if a filmmaker regularly casts different stars from picture to picture, because not that many do. They tend to go back to the same well. They're great together, but Marty has worked with De Niro and DiCaprio over and over and over. On that note, Weir never directed a Tom Schulman screenplay again. Schulman used his own life as inspiration in coming up with this story. He had a great teacher who inspired him when he went to prep school. Tom went on to write mostly comedies like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, What About Bob, I'm Sailing. And then the man went and ended Gene Hackman's career with the Welcome to Mooseport script. And with a resume like that, maybe we have our answer for why he and Weir didn't make another movie together. The producers who were up for that Best Picture Oscar were Stephen Haft, Paul Junger-Witt, or is it Younger? Junger, and Tony Thomas. Haft worked with Williams again when they made Jacob the Liar, while Witt had worked with Robin's buddy Billy Crystal on Soap back in the 70s, that TV show, the parody soap opera show. Then he helped get Three Kings made for David O. Russell. Thomas shares a lot of credits with Witt, so I guess they're a producing team. Maurice Jarre composed the music and John Seale shot the flick. William Anderson, Mr. Anderson, different Anderson, was the editor. Jarre won 3 Oscars, all for David Lean flicks, including for the ultra-famous Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago scores. I like his music a lot in this, too. As for John Seale shooting motion pictures, he was the DP on Mad Max Fury Road when he was in his 70s, and that is such a beautiful movie. Like the sequel, by the way. Bev and I saw it recently. It's pretty good, too. It's not that far behind the first one. Too long, though. It's too long. Johnny Boy won a Gold Naked Guy for his work on The English Patient 7 years after this came out, but he also did some excellent lighting on another Best Picture winner, Rain Man, which we covered many years ago. And as for William Anderson, he cut a lot of Weir's other flicks, including The Great Truman Show. To put a finishing touch in this review, I'm a fan, always have been. In the history of great teacher movies, this has to rank somewhere fairly highly. Robin gets to riff, which seems a little out of place for a stodgy prep school in the 50s, but they mostly found a way to make it seem like something this guy might do. The movie is often fairly funny, which it should be. It stars Robin Williams. His character has soul, too, which is the reason why I think he was recognized at awards time. And even though most of the young dead poets didn't really go on to have incredible acting careers, the main character in the story is played by a guy who really has done some great things. And that's Ethan Hawke, not the guy who played Meeks. So that was how I saw Dead Poet Society. Before I wrap and promote our upcoming podcasts, I promised a new wrinkle. Well, here it is. Trivia. To repeat, maybe for the sake of those who came in late, these are questions I came up with for our trivia nights that I've been hosting for Bev and our friends ever since the start of the pandemic. We couldn't go to the bar anymore, so I took over the duties of the guy who tried to stump us at Stout on Carlton. Cheap plug for a pretty good pub. Anyway, maybe I'll try to make these triv questions relevant to the movie of the week in future episodes, but these 3 are just questions. And if you want to cheat and look up the answers, fine, but I will answer them all before the end of today's show, so be patient. So number 1, and I guess this does tie into Dead Poets Society because I talked about that Manana episode of Friends. Well, here's the question, and it's about Friends. My favorite episode of Friends is the one where Chandler and Joey play Monica and Rachel in a trivia game. In the lightning round, what do we learn Rachel tells people is her favorite movie, and what is her actual favorite movie? Question number 2. Angelina Jolie has been married 3 times. Who was her first husband? It wasn't her brother, don't think that way. Question number 3. John Turturro has a lot of fun playing Jesus the Bowler in The Big Lebowski. And I won't quote him because this episode is PG rated, or G rated, I guess. Funny line I'm thinking of, though. What is the name of his teammate? So there's the 3. We'll get to the answers after I do some promoting. And I'll say this, in 2 weeks, I'll be back in the chair on my own, and I'll be going all the way back to 1934, focusing on The Thin Man. I figured Bev and I would chat about this classic rom-com together, but now that she's taking on a slightly later podcast schedule, this was one of the titles she passed on in order to cover a movie she knows she'd love to discuss. She's never seen it before, but she does plan to watch it with me. So it'll be just me jiving on Powell and Loy 2 Fridays from now. But in 3 days, on Monday the 9th, Bev will be back on the pod, and she and I will be yammering about Boyhood. If you like Ethan Hawke, you're going to love us this year. It's been a Hawke fest. Talk back to me about this show or any others we've done. The email address is haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. I can be tweeted. My handle is @MovieFiend51. Bev's is @BevEllisEllis. She uses that on Threads, too. We also post all our shows on YouTube. The place to be in your browser is @HYESEllis, or just type Have You Ever Seen into the search bar when you're on the TubeTube. Comment about and like our show there, and also rate and review us on your podcast app. And go over to sparkplug.coffee/HYES and get your 20% discount by using our HYES promo code if you haven't already. You only do that one time. As for the answers to the trivia questions, here we go. Number 1, the Friends question. What is Rachel's favorite movie that she says is her favorite movie? What's her actual favorite movie? Dangerous Liaisons, Weekend at Bernie's are the 2 answers. Those are back-to-back years, by the way, 88 and 89. Number 2, who is Angelina Jolie's first husband? Johnny Lee Miller, an actor also. She married Billy Bob and Brad Pitt, but they were number 2 and number 3. And the third trivia question, John Turturro has a lot of fun playing Jesus the Bowler in The Big Lebowski. The name of his teammate? Liam. Me and Liam gonna blank you up next Saturday, wherever that line goes. And that's that. Thanks for being here. Join us on Monday when the movie of the day will be Boyhood. Meantime, I'm going to stand on my desk and quote Walt Whitman as my supportive teacher thanks me with tears in his eyes. I haven't really mentioned that Walt Whitman's a huge part of this happening. Well, he was a very big part of the movie, and Keating is often quoting him. Then, while that inspirational teacher walks away in disgrace, I will face the music and maybe be expelled from my high school prep school. Thank you, Robin. Thank you. And cut.